And so you listened. You studied hard, did your homework. You've probably spent over 16 years of your life in school, but how many of those years were truly dedicated to teaching you how to think, not just what to memorize? From the very beginning, education felt like something you had to do, not something you chose. You were given a path: study, follow the rules, pass the test, move on. You were told that this was the way to success, and so you listened. You studied hard, did your homework, behaved well, and followed the steps like you were supposed to. Maybe you even excelled. Maybe you got the grades, the diploma, the job. On the outside, it looks like everything worked, but on the inside, something doesn't feel right. You're able to function in the world. You can earn a living, keep a routine, meet expectations. But when things get quiet, when you're alone with your thoughts, there's a lingering question that school never prepared you for. Who am I? What do I really want?
At 55 years old and think it's too late to invest? Hear me out. For people over 50 who didn't invest 20 years.
Who am I? What do I really want? Why do I feel so disconnected, even when I've done everything I was told would make me feel whole? It's a feeling many people carry, but rarely speak about. According to a 2021 survey by Pew Research Center, over 60% of adults in the U.S., many of them highly educated, admit they've questioned the purpose of their lives. That number doesn't point to individual failure. It points to a deeper flaw in the system itself. Modern education was never designed to help you understand yourself. It was created to make you useful, to train you to serve a system, not to help you become a conscious, self-aware individual. And that's the part no one really talks about. Behind the lessons and exams, behind the diplomas and degrees, is a quiet blueprint to produce workers, not thinkers, to train obedience, not insight, to reward repetition, not reflection. You were taught to remember, not to understand, to conform, not to question, to meet expectations, not to explore your own inner world. The irony is, you may have become successful in the eyes of society, but feel like a stranger in your own life. You can fulfill roles, meet goals, carry responsibilities, yet feel emotionally underdeveloped, uncertain, or disconnected from your core self. Why? Because you were never taught to explore it. You were trained to function in the world, but not to make sense of it, not to ask the deeper questions, not to pause and listen inwardly, not to sit with discomfort long enough to uncover who you really are. And that's the cost of an education that focuses only on productivity and performance. It leaves you well-equipped to play a role, but unequipped to know if that role is even yours. It teaches you how to succeed in the eyes of others, but never how to define success for yourself. And when the applause fades, when the checklist is complete, when the next step no longer feels obvious, the silence creeps in. That quiet voice you've ignored for years begins to whisper, is this really me? Is this what I wanted? Or is this just who I was told to become? This isn't just about school. It's about how education shaped your sense of self. It's about the way a system trained you to look outward for answers, for approval, for identity, while your inner world remained unexplored. And now, as an adult, you're left piecing it together, searching for meaning in a life that was never built on understanding, only on achievement. That is the great deception. Not that education failed, but that it never intended to help you find yourself in the first place. Somewhere along the way, something changed. Education, which could have been a journey of discovery, slowly became a system of control. What began as a natural instinct, the desire to explore, to ask questions, to understand, was reshaped into something mechanical. You started school with curiosity. You asked questions. You wandered off topic. You wanted to know why. But the system wasn't built for that. It wasn't designed to nourish your inner spark. It was designed to measure, standardize, and evaluate, to turn a living mind into a manageable product. So little by little, the wonder faded. You stopped asking why, not because you lost interest, but because you learned that too many questions made you a problem. You remember being told you were disruptive for wanting to know more, that raising your hand too often was annoying, that asking questions outside the textbook meant you weren't on track. And over time, you adjusted. You gave the answers they wanted. You memorized the right information. You stayed inside the lines. You learned that it was safer to follow than to challenge, easier to absorb than to explore. You began to associate learning with pressure, anxiety, and performance. You didn't read because you were curious. You read because you were tested. You didn't write to express. You wrote to fit a rubric. You stopped thinking to understand and started thinking to comply. And the more you adapted to the system, the more you lost touch with the part of you that once loved learning for its own sake. You learned to perform, not to pursue, to repeat, not to reflect, to pass exams, not to expand your mind. And the most dangerous part, you were praised for it. You were told you were a good student, not because you thought for yourself, but because you didn't make trouble. You followed instructions. You didn't question authority. You did exactly what was expected. But what does that really mean? If education rewards obedience over originality, what kind of intelligence is it really cultivating? Krishnamurti once said, "Real education means awakening the capacity to think for oneself." But thinking for yourself is not convenient for a system built on conformity. Independent minds challenge the script. They don't fit easily into standardized tests. They don't follow one-size-fits-all schedules. So instead of awakening thought, the system teaches imitation. Instead of nurturing questions, it drills answers. The result is a kind of quiet flattening of the human spirit, a slow erosion of what makes each person unique. The child who once asked bold questions becomes the adult who fears being wrong. The teenager who once challenged authority becomes the professional who never questions the company policy. The learner becomes the follower, and the system calls that success. But is it really success if it costs us our curiosity? Is it really growth if it numbs the desire to know, to explore, to create? When you look back, how much of your education was truly yours? How much of it felt alive, connected to your passions, your questions, your path? And how much of it was simply compliance, an endless loop of assignments, scores, and silent pressure? The tragedy isn't that we learned facts. It's that we stopped asking what they meant, that we were taught how to answer but not how to wonder, that the joy of discovery was replaced by the fear of getting it wrong. Education became less about igniting the mind and more about managing the output, less about awakening and more about obedience. And now many of us carry that conditioning into adulthood, still afraid to ask too many questions, still waiting for permission, still measuring our worth by how well we perform, instead of how deeply we think. But maybe it's time to unlearn what was imposed. Maybe the first step to reclaiming our minds is not to learn more, but to remember what we once knew. That real education begins the moment we stop repeating and start thinking for ourselves. But to understand how we got here, how education shifted from exploration to obedience, we have to look deeper. This wasn't an accident. The structure of modern education didn't just appear one day. It was carefully built, shaped by the needs of a very specific kind of world, one that prioritized order, productivity, and control. The origins of the school system as we know it are not rooted in a desire to cultivate free thinkers. They are rooted in the industrial age, a time when governments and factories needed disciplined, predictable workers, not poets, not philosophers, not visionaries, but people who could follow instructions, meet quotas, and operate within rigid hierarchy. And so schools were modeled accordingly. Look closely and the parallels are striking. A bell rings to start the day. You sit in rows. You follow a schedule divided by subjects, just like shifts in a factory. You move from one task to the next on command. You are rewarded for compliance. You are penalized for deviation. Creativity becomes secondary, conformity becomes sacred. Ivan Illich, in Deschooling Society, called it out plainly: school is the new church, its dogma is conformity. And he was right. The system doesn't just teach information, it teaches belief. A belief in structure, in hierarchy, in the idea that success means following the rules set by someone else. That your worth is determined by how well you fit the mold, not how bravely you break it. This wasn't always the case. Learning in its purest form has always been about liberation, about opening the mind to possibilities, about challenging assumptions, not memorizing them. But when education became institutionalized, when it was tied to economies and state interests, it stopped being about growth and started being about management. Think about it. The classroom teaches more than just math or history. It teaches punctuality, obedience, deference to authority. It teaches you not just what to know, but how to behave. And the message is clear: stay in line, don't question the system, keep your head down, and you'll be rewarded. And for a long time, that model worked for society. It created generations of workers who knew how to follow procedures, meet deadlines, and sustain the machinery of production. But what it didn't do was create people who knew how to live deeply, to think critically, or to define meaning on their own terms. The tragedy is that this system became invisible. We stopped seeing it as a design and started accepting it as the natural way of things. We forgot that education could be different, that it didn't have to feel like a slow erasure of individuality, that it wasn't meant to feel like a job you start at age 5 and retire from at 22. And so we grew up inside a structure that quietly trained us to seek permission, to wait for approval, to fear mistakes, to trust institutions more than our own intuition. It shaped our minds before we knew we had minds to shape. It told us what to value before we had the chance to decide for ourselves. And most of us never thought to question it, because questioning was never part of the lesson plan. This is the silent history of modern education, not a path to self-discovery, but a program of social conditioning, not a celebration of the human spirit, but a system of behavioral engineering. And until we recognize that, we'll keep mistaking training for wisdom, compliance for growth, and structure for truth. And what happens after we leave that system? After years of being trained to meet expectations, follow schedules, and succeed by external standards, what kind of adults do we become? Many of us walk into the real world carrying degrees, certificates, impressive resumes. On paper, we look prepared. We're educated, qualified, ready. But inside, something's missing. We know how to solve equations, write reports, manage deadlines. But when life throws something unexpected at us, something personal, messy, and deeply human, we freeze. Because nobody taught us how to navigate the storms that don't come with instructions. No one showed us how to make decisions rooted in self-knowledge. No one prepared us to sit with uncertainty or to ask, what do I really want from this life? And so when the structure disappears, when we're no longer graded, no longer told what to do, we feel lost, disoriented, empty. It's a feeling more common than we think. You can have a stable job, a solid income, even recognition from others. But then something breaks. A divorce, a layoff, a death in the family. And suddenly, all those years of achievement feel like they didn't prepare you for anything that truly matters. You realize you were educated to perform, but never to reflect. Trained to succeed, but never to feel. taught to plan, but never to understand who's doing the planning in the first place. Psychology Today reported in 2020 that many adults experience high levels of anxiety when facing personal decisions, precisely because they were conditioned to follow guidance from others, not because they're incapable of choosing, but because they were never taught how. For so long, someone else made the choices, what to study, what's considered success, what path to follow. And even now, as adults, we often carry that same habit into our lives, seeking permission, approval, certainty from outside ourselves. We confuse our accomplishments with self-knowledge. But the truth is, you can have a master's degree and still not know what brings you peace. You can earn awards and still feel directionless. You can be praised for your discipline, your work ethic, your ambition, and still wake up one day wondering whose life you're actually living. The system taught you how to chase goals, but it never asked you if those goals were your own. And so we move through life like actors playing a role. We hit milestones, check boxes, build careers, but in the quiet moments when no one's watching, we sense the truth, that we're strangers to ourselves, that we've been climbing ladders that lean against the wrong walls. That success without understanding is just another mask. This isn't just a personal issue. It's a psychological consequence of being raised in a system that never prioritized self-inquiry, a system that rewarded right answers but discouraged real questions, that prized productivity over presence, that cared more about grades than about growth. And the impact is real, not just emotionally, but existentially. We struggle with identity, purpose, direction, not because we're broken, but because we were never shown how to look inward. No test ever asked, "What do you love?" No curriculum ever taught, "How do you deal with grief?" No school ever gave you credit for learning how to forgive yourself. But these are the lessons that shape us. These are the truths that anchor us when life gets hard. And without them, we drift. Educated, but unsure. Accomplished, but unfulfilled. This is the shadow side of modern education, not its failure to deliver knowledge, but its failure to guide us toward wisdom. Not its lack of structure, but its lack of soul. And unless we face that truth, we'll keep mistaking performance for purpose and wonder silently why we still feel so empty. At some point, if you're lucky, or maybe if life pushes you hard enough, you begin to notice something unsettling. A quiet realization starts to take shape, that what you believe about yourself, about success, about what makes life meaningful, might not be entirely your own. It feels like waking up from a dream you didn't know you were having, like looking at your life and realizing it's been shaped not by conscious choice, but by unconscious programming. Because education didn't just teach you facts, it taught you how to think, or more accurately, what not to question. It handed you a script about what's valuable, what's respectable, what's acceptable. And over time, that script became invisible. It became your inner voice, your default. The system didn't just train you to perform, it trained you to believe. And those beliefs run deeper than you realize. You may not remember the moment it happened, but you started to fear being too different. You learned to avoid standing out. You started measuring your worth by how well you fit in. And now, even as an adult, there's still that discomfort when someone challenges the norm, when someone lives in a way that doesn't follow the plan. A quiet voice inside you whispers, "That's risky. That's strange. That's not how things are done." You might feel uneasy without a schedule, lost when there's no one telling you what the next step should be. You might succeed in every way society tells you matters, status, income, recognition, yet feel strangely disconnected from yourself.
With Milo's rewards, every purchase earns points towards Milo's money. Lowe's points for
Feel strangely disconnected from yourself, like you're playing a role that was written long before you knew who you were. And that's not your fault. It's the result of years, decades of conditioning. Conditioning that equates obedience with intelligence, routine with safety, productivity with worth. We weren't just taught what to know. We were taught what to fear. We were taught to be suspicious of stillness, of uncertainty, of anything that didn't come with external validation. Krishnamurti once said, "It is no sign of intelligence to adapt to a deeply sick society."
ChatGPT gets 123 million visits a day, and most people still use it like a toy. Here,
And yet, adaptation is exactly what we were praised for. We were told that fitting in was a sign of maturity, that questioning the system was rebellion, that success meant aligning ourselves with values we never paused to examine. And in doing so, we learned to suppress the parts of us that didn't conform, the questions, the instincts, the creative impulses. But now the cracks are showing. You start to see the limits of the beliefs you've inherited. You notice how often your decisions are driven by fear of judgment, not by inner truth. How your self-worth fluctuates with productivity. How rest feels guilty. How saying "I don't know" feels like failure. These are not natural reactions. They're learned patterns, programmed responses to a system that rewarded control over curiosity and silence over self-expression. And the first step in breaking free isn't to change everything overnight. It's simply to notice, to question the unquestioned, to ask, where did this belief come from? Who benefits from it? And does it still serve me? Because until you recognize the programming, you're still living inside it, still operating within a framework designed not to help you thrive, but to keep you aligned with an outdated model of life. This is the beginning of awakening, not a dramatic moment of rebellion, but a quiet return to yourself, a recognition that so many of the limits you live with aren't real. They were taught that your discomfort with freedom isn't a flaw. It's a result of being trained to fear it. And once you see that, you can begin to unlearn, to rebuild, to remember who you were before you were told who to be. Once you begin to see the programming, something inside you shifts. You start to realize that the real work ahead isn't about fixing yourself, but about reclaiming yourself. Not becoming someone new, but remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. And that journey, though quiet, is nothing short of revolutionary. Because now you don't just want to learn, you want to understand. You don't want to keep memorizing information you'll forget. You want to explore ideas that stir something inside you. You want to read not to pass an exam, but to feed your curiosity. You want to write not to meet a rubric, but to hear your own thoughts out loud, to make sense of the chaos within. You want to learn not to achieve, but to live more fully. This is the beginning of a different kind of education, one that doesn't start in a classroom, but in the questions you're finally willing to ask. Questions like, what do I actually believe? And more importantly, why do I believe it? Are these values truly mine, or were they passed down unquestioned through generations, institutions, and expectations? What kind of life feels true to me, not just acceptable to others? And as you walk that path slowly, you begin to dismantle the invisible cage. You stop fearing the blank space in your calendar. You stop needing constant structure to feel secure. You stop defining your worth by productivity. You learn to sit with silence. You learn to tolerate the unknown. And in doing so, you create space for something deeper to emerge. Something that has been waiting for your attention all along. But this journey isn't just for you. It becomes something you pass on. When you raise children, teach students, or simply influence those around you, you begin to ask, am I teaching them to obey or to ask? Am I preparing them for tests or preparing them to know themselves? Am I praising them for compliance or for courage? Because real education isn't about shaping people to fit a system. It's about equipping them to shape their own lives. It's not about teaching them to play a role, but to question whether the role is even worth playing. It's not about telling them what to think, but empowering them to think for themselves, even if it takes them down a path no one else understands. And that kind of education doesn't require a classroom. It requires honesty, intention, and a willingness to face yourself. It begins in the books you choose, the words you write, the questions you stop avoiding. It grows in the way you listen, the way you pause, the way you choose truth over comfort again and again. In the end, real education is not preparation for life. It is life itself. It happens when you begin living as yourself, not as a role, not as a product, not as a projection of other people's hopes and fears, but as someone who has remembered how to feel, how to wonder, how to choose. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all, that you were never meant to just fit in. You were meant to wake up, to unlearn, to return to yourself, and in doing so, finally begin.
That was one, y'all. Let's get into the other one. Let's see. Boom.
That's the plan. That's the path. They told you freedom would come at 65. That if you work They told you freedom would come at 65. That if you worked hard, stayed loyal, and kept climbing the ladder for 4 decades, They told you freedom would come at 65. That if you worked hard, stayed loyal, and kept climbing the ladder for 4 decades, one day you'd be free. Free to travel, to relax, to finally live. Retirement was painted as the promised land, the reward at the end of a long, obedient life. But what if that promise was never real? What if it was a carefully crafted illusion to keep you moving, producing, complying, without ever questioning the cost? For most of your life, the script has been clear. Study hard, get a job, work for 40 years, retire. That's the plan, that's the path. And most people follow it without ever asking who wrote it in the first place. But the truth waiting at the end of that path is far from liberating. According to a 2020 study by the Stanford Center on Longevity, over 2/3 of retirees in America feel disoriented within just 18 months of retiring, and not because they ran out of money, but because they ran out of identity. They suddenly wake up in a world where their role, their purpose, their very sense of self has vanished. You see, the system didn't prepare them for freedom. It prepared them to function. It trained them to operate within a machine, not to live beyond it. Retirement isn't the grand reward they were promised. It's the quiet dismissal from the stage. The moment the role ends, the spotlight fades and no one tells you what to do next. And that's where the existential crisis begins. Because what do you do when you've spent your entire life performing a role, and then that role disappears? Who are you without your job title, without the emails, the deadlines, the meetings that made you feel important? For decades, your value was measured by productivity, not presence. And now that the system no longer needs you, you're expected to know how to simply enjoy life, without ever having been taught how. Retirement was never about freedom. It was about timing your usefulness. It was never designed for you to explore your inner self or to reconnect with what truly matters. It was designed to phase you out, a graceful exit from the machine, while convincing you it's a reward. That's the brilliance of the lie. It doesn't sound cruel, it sounds like a gift. But Alan Watts said it best. You are under no obligation to be the person you were told to be. That sentence shatters the foundation of the retirement myth. Because if you were never meant to follow someone else's script in the first place, then maybe retirement isn't the end of a chapter. Maybe it's the moment you realize the book was never yours to begin with. And that realization hurts, because it forces you to confront a deeper question. What does it mean to be free? If you've spent your whole life waiting for permission to live, are you truly living at all? We are taught to delay everything: joy, rest, discovery, reflection, as if life will finally begin when the work is over. But life doesn't wait. It doesn't start at 65. It has been happening all along, and most of us were too busy preparing for it to notice. So maybe the real lie isn't just about retirement. Maybe the lie is that you ever needed to wait for freedom at all. Maybe freedom was never a destination. It was a way of being, one you could have chosen at any point. But no one told you that, because a free person can't be controlled. A free person doesn't need the script. A free person sees retirement not as a reward, but as a reminder that we traded our days for a promise that was never real. And now we're left wondering what life could have been.
Everything that was taught to us was a motherfucking lie.
If freedom was never the real goal.
Hey, did you know that Lowe's has a rewards program? Yeah, I think subconsciously I did. With eligible purchases.
If freedom was never the real goal, then what was? To understand that, we need to step back and look at the structure, the machine that shaped your life before you even knew it. Because what most of us call normal isn't natural at all. It's a system, one built not to empower individuals, but to standardize them. Starting in the 20th century, human life was quietly industrialized. Not just labor, life itself. It was broken down into predictable stages: education, employment, retirement, death. From the moment you're born, the path is already mapped. Go to school, get good grades, learn how to sit still and follow instructions. Then pick a career, clock in, clock out, repeat for 40 years. Then, if you're lucky, you get a few quiet years at the end before your time runs out.
Right.
But here's what they never told you. Retirement wasn't created for your benefit. It was created to manage productivity. The concept dates back to 1889 when German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck introduced it, not as a gift to workers, but as a way to remove the elderly from the workforce and make room for younger, more efficient labor. Retirement was economic policy disguised as compassion, and over time, we accepted it as truth. The system never asked what kind of life you wanted. It asked what kind of worker you could become. And slowly, silently, it began to define your worth by how well you could serve its needs. You weren't encouraged to ask why you worked, only how hard. You weren't taught to question the routine, only to improve your efficiency within it. A 2007 publication from the American Psychological Association, The Retiring Mind, put it bluntly. Modern humans have never designed their own lives. They simply follow plans laid out by others.
Right.
And when you really think about it, isn't that what most of us do? We inherit a template. We follow the model. We spend our most vital years working, often more than 47 hours a week, and never stop to ask, what am I working for? Who is this actually serving? This is the deeper deception, that your life belongs to you when in truth it's been scheduled, scripted, and monetized from the start. The education system trains you for labor. The labor system demands your time, and the retirement system quietly dismisses you when your utility begins to decline. The entire structure is designed for maximum output, not personal fulfillment, and yet most people never resist it. Not because they agree, but because they've never seen another option. When a machine is all you've ever known, silence starts to feel like peace. But it's not peace, it's numbness. You're not free, you're just no longer questioning. The tragedy is that many people don't even realize they're inside a machine until it's too late. Until the noise stops and they're left sitting in the quiet, wondering where all the time went. Because when your life is built around schedules, deadlines, productivity metrics, and future goals, you lose touch with the present moment. with your own inner compass, with what it means to live a life you've actually chosen. You weren't born to be a gear in a machine. You were born to experience life, to feel deeply, to create, to connect, to explore. But a system that runs on control has no room for that kind of freedom. So it sells you a version of life that feels safe, structured, respectable, and quietly drains your spirit in the process. And that's the real question modern society never wants you to ask. What if the life I've been living isn't really mine at all? Once you begin to see the machine for what it is, another truth becomes painfully clear. The system didn't just take your time. It shaped your identity. It taught you to see yourself not as a being, but as a function. You were a teacher, a manager, a doctor, an engineer. And for most of your life, that role defined who you were. Until one day, it ends. And so does the sense of self. This is the part no one prepares you for. When the meetings stop, the titles disappear, and the calendar goes blank. On the surface, you should feel free. But instead, many feel lost. Not because they miss the work, but because they lose themselves. They no longer know who they are without the role. The identity they spent decades building is suddenly gone. According to the National Institute on Aging, depression rates increase by over 40% during the first year of retirement. And it's not because people lack money, comfort, or time. It's because they're forced to answer a question they've never asked. If I'm no longer working, who am I? This is the crisis that hides beneath the surface, the one no financial advisor can prepare you for. It's not about income, it's about identity. And when that identity was built on function, its collapse feels like a quiet death. A death that happens while you're still breathing, while you're still here but not sure who's left inside. There's a post on Reddit from a man named John, 64 years old, recently retired from Boeing after a life as an engineer. He wrote, "I realized I never actually lived. I just worked. And now that the work is over, I have no idea what to do." His words are raw, honest, and painfully common, because John's story is not unique. It's a mirror of countless lives. Lives where identity and profession became one, until there was no separation left between the man and the job. For years, we're told to strive, to climb, to produce, but no one teaches us how to simply exist. So when the striving ends, the silence is deafening. And in it, you feel the weight of everything you once postponed, the curiosity you never followed, the passions you buried, the parts of you that didn't fit the role, so they were left behind. And that's the illusion, the idea that your value lies in being useful, that worth equals function. But as Alan Watts once said, you are not a role. You are the playing of life itself. You were never meant to be just one thing. Life was never meant to be a single job title carried to the grave. But it takes a courage to face the void that opens when the role ends. Because that void isn't empty. It's full of questions. The kind you were too busy to ask when the calendar ruled your life. What do I love? What moves me? What do I believe in beyond what I was told to believe? These are the questions that mark the beginning of real freedom, but they require the death of the old identity, the dismantling of the mask, the shedding of the function, the birth of a self that was hidden beneath the role. And maybe that's why the system never wanted you to stop, because in silence, you remember who you were before the mask. And that memory, that spark, is the beginning of something the machine cannot control. A self that is free, not because it retired from work, but because it awakened to life. But even after the role ends, the machine doesn't let you go. It just gives you a new one. This time, not as a worker, but as a consumer. You don't retire from the system. You retire into another system, one designed to profit off the years you have left. The moment you step out of your career, you step into the crosshairs of a trillion-dollar industry, the business of retirement freedom. It's a seductive illusion, one that sells you peace, leisure, fulfillment. all neatly packaged in cruise brochures, real estate pitches, financial plans, and insurance portfolios. You're told this is your time to enjoy life, to travel the world, to finally live. But here's the trick. It's not freedom they're offering, it's a product. And the product isn't the trip, the condo, or the lifestyle. The product is you. Or more precisely, your desire to feel in control after decades of being controlled. They sell you comfort because they know you're afraid of chaos. They sell you plans because they know you've never lived without one. So instead of encouraging inner freedom, they offer external order, a new routine of spending, managing, maintaining, a continuation of structure disguised as liberation. And just like that, retirement becomes a market, not a milestone.
I might be the only person online sharing every single trade I make, completely free of charge.
Becomes a market, not a milestone. A demographic, not a discovery. You're not free. You're just being softly reabsorbed into a more mature corner of the same machine. And the most convincing part of the lie? It feels reasonable, practical, even responsible. You're told to meet with financial advisors to plan your portfolio to maximize your retirement years. But few stop to ask, who benefits from these plans? Who profits from your compliance? The uncomfortable truth is that most financial advice isn't neutral. It's an industry, and industries have motives. The same institutions urging you to chase retirement security are the ones collecting fees, commissions, and interest from the very plans they recommend. Your freedom has a price tag, and they're the ones cashing in. We're led to believe that safety equals freedom, that the more protected, insured, and prepared we are, the freer we'll feel. But Alan Watts exposed the trap. The desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing. To hold your breath is to lose your breath. The more you chase stability, the more fragile you become. Because true freedom isn't a carefully managed retirement account. It isn't a beachfront condo or a senior discount on a Mediterranean cruise. It isn't comfort wrapped in fear. It's the ability to see through the illusion, to recognize that most of what you've been sold as freedom is just another layer of control. That doesn't mean there's no value in rest, in travel, or in financial planning. It means those things are only meaningful when they come from intention, not indoctrination. If your retirement is just another script, another checklist of things you're supposed to do, then you haven't escaped the system at all. You've simply changed costumes. The real tragedy isn't that people want to enjoy life after working. It's that they were never shown how to enjoy it while they were working. They were trained to delay, to defer, to survive. And when the moment finally arrives to live, they're still following someone else's plan. Because freedom isn't found in what you can buy after 65. It's found in the courage to ask, what if I stopped buying into the lie altogether? But maybe the biggest lie wasn't just the promise of retirement. Maybe it was what came long before that, the training. Because from the moment you were old enough to understand the world, you were taught to wait, to postpone joy, to delay life. First, it was, when I graduate, then when I get the job, then when I get promoted, when I pay off the house, when I retire, then you'll be happy. Then you'll feel free. Then you'll really start living. But then never comes because you've been conditioned to chase it, like a mirage on the horizon that disappears every time you think you're close. Your brain has been trained not to experience the present, but to project constantly into a future that doesn't exist. This isn't just metaphor. Behavioral psychology has a name for it: delay discounting. The tendency to undervalue present experiences in favor of imagined rewards later. The more you delay gratification, the more you train your mind to believe that now is never enough, that life is always somewhere else. And so you live your days in a kind of suspended animation, checking boxes, meeting deadlines, saving for later. You become an expert in survival, not presence. You know how to budget, schedule, optimize, but not how to be still, to feel deeply, to listen to the quiet voice inside. By the time you reach retirement, you don't know how to live. You only know how to wait. And the tragedy is, you think that's normal, but it's not life you've been preparing for. It's death in slow motion. A life postponed becomes a life unlived. You've been so busy measuring your value by how productive, how successful, how secure you are, that you've forgotten how to exist. And when the structure falls away, when the job ends and the roles dissolve, what's left is the terrifying realization you never really arrived. You were always on your way to something else. Alan Watts saw this trap decades ago. He warned us, stop measuring your life, live it. But that message is hard to hear in a society that rewards planning and punishes presence. We're told that productivity is virtue, that hustle is meaning, that slowing down is weakness. So we internalize the belief that rest must be earned, that joy is a luxury, that aliveness is conditional. And before we know it, our entire existence becomes a rehearsal, a long, anxious preparation for a performance that never begins. But here's the truth. There is no grand finale, no perfect moment, no final destination where everything makes sense and nothing hurts. Life is happening right now, in the chaos, in the quiet, in the uncertainty, in the breath you just took. And if you can't touch it now, you won't touch it later, because later is just another word for never when you've been taught to delay everything. The system doesn't just steal your time, it steals your presence. It convinces you that living is something you do after you've earned it. But you don't have to earn your own existence. You never did. You don't need permission to feel joy. You don't need a reason to be fully alive. So the question is no longer, when will you start living? The real question is, will you ever stop waiting? So what do we do with all this? After stripping away the myths, the roles, the scripts, what's left? Just this, a choice. Because real freedom isn't something you wait for. It isn't something handed to you after decades of loyalty to a system. And it sure as hell isn't something you buy with a pension plan. Real freedom is a capacity, not a condition. It's not about having more time. It's about having the power to be fully alive in the time you already have. Freedom is presence. It's the ability to meet life as it is, not as you wish it would be, or as you planned it, or as they told you it should look. And the wildest part? You don't have to retire to find it. You can start now, inside the very system that tried to take it from you. You can retire from the mentality before you ever retire from the job. That begins with redefining who you are, not by what you do, not by the role you play, but by what you value. What lights you up? What feels real when everything else falls quiet? Maybe you've spent decades being an engineer, a manager, a provider, but beneath that, you've always been something deeper, a creator, a seeker, a soul. So build your life from that center. Create a new schedule, one that honors more than just deadlines and obligations. Make time for purposeful silence, time where nothing needs to be achieved, solved, or improved. Time to just be. That space is where freedom begins. Not in doing more, but in doing less with more intention. And when it comes to connection, shift the focus. Don't chase experiences for the sake of checking boxes or collecting memories like souvenirs. Choose depth over novelty. Choose people who see you, not just roles you can play. Choose conversations that move you, not just moments that distract you. Because what we're really starving for, beneath all the plans and purchases, is presence with each other. That's where meaning lives. Alan Watts once said, "This is the real secret of life, to be completely engaged with the now." That's not just philosophy, it's a survival skill. In a world that's constantly pulling you toward later, toward someday, toward what's next, your ability